YouTube channel. My name is Annie, and I am the events coordinator for Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which, if you don't know us, is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we are very pleased to be bringing you virtual author events on these social media channels. So thanks for tuning in, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Very happy to have you. Tonight's event is super special because we have so many readers. We are talking about the Best Women's Travel Writing Volume 12, and we're going to be here with Lavinia Spalding, who is the editor of this volume. And then we're also going to be hearing from a couple of the contributors, which are going to be Mathangi Subramanian, Vodicka, and Colette Hanahan. And we are going to hear a little bit from each of their contributions, and then we are going to hear a discussion between the four of them. And you are welcome to ask questions. The way you do that is by typing into the chat. So if you're watching on Facebook, type in the comments underneath this video. If you're watching on YouTube, use that live chat function, and we will see them come up, and we will choose some questions to talk about at the end of the event. Until then, please just let us know where you're watching from. Say hello, let us know who you are. So happy that you've tuned in. I see there's some of you watching now, so yeah, let us know who you are and where you're watching from. And then finally, of course, there is a book associated with this event. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can do that at the bookstore's website, which is majorsandquinn.com. I will drop a link directly to that book into the chat as well, so you can go straight there, or you can just head to majorsandquinn.com and search Best Women's Travel Writing, or search for Lavinia Spalding, because she is listed as the editor. So thank you again for being here, and I will be back for your questions later on in the evening. For now, Lavinia is going to talk a little bit about the book.
Thank you, Annie. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having us, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in. Yeah, so this is the Best Women's Travel Writing, Volume 12. So it's the 12th one in the series, and it's the 6th that I've edited. It's published by Traveler's Tales, and Traveler's Tales is a California-based publishing house that's been putting out travel books and anthologies for 20-some years. The New York Times review of the Best Women's Travel Writing for the last volume said their books, I wrote it down, their books might best be described as the literary equivalent of a group of travelers sitting around a dim cafe, sipping pints or Prosecco and trading their best stories. And it's really just an incredible honor to get to edit this anthology for them. This one includes 34 essays that take place as close as Maryland and Florida, and as far away as Bhutan and Tanzania, with wildly diverse themes and voices. And yeah, this volume is very special to me. It was an interesting year to edit it, as you might imagine, for a couple of reasons. I hadn't put one out in a few years, for one thing, and so I just had a bumper crop of submissions. I got about 1,300 essays to read, and most I'd ever received before that was probably 600. So I had a lot of reading to do, but luckily, or not luckily, depending on how you look at it, all my own travel was canceled. So I had a lot of time to do that reading. And it proved sort of strangely comforting to be able to sit on my couch, even though my own trips to Colombia and Paris were off. But just to sit there and travel the world through the words and the memories and the stories of so many amazing women, most of whom I didn't know. But I did feel a little lost when it came time to write my introduction, to be writing during a global pandemic and a racial reckoning and everything that was going on in the world. I just really, I didn't know what to write. And so I decided to sort of write into that lostness. And I thought about one of the last trips I had taken, which was a trip to Fez, Morocco, and how lost I had felt there in the Medina. And so I sort of tried to connect that sensation of being lost there with how I was feeling. And I'm going to just read a little bit from my introduction, after which I'll bring in the three contributors who are joining me here tonight. And so let's see, I'm just going to jump in and I'll just read a little bit. The Medina was a clogged, chaotic blur, an ever-swirling kaleidoscope of color and sound and scent. And while mesmerized, I tried hard to keep my bearings. I didn't stand a chance. I got lost every 2 minutes, anytime I unbolted the heavy door of my riad and stepped outside, or exited a cafe, or craned my neck to gaze at a thin bookmark of blue sky above the peeling paint of an orange wall. I got lost because the Medina's serpentine byways are mostly unnamed, and because I had no cell service, and thus no GPS, and neglected to orient myself by obvious landmarks, and because the meticulously detailed map my riad host annotated and explained 13 times looked more to me like a brain than a map. It didn't help that I have a poor sense of direction. Wherever I go in the world, I become at least temporarily misplaced. Still, the version of disorientation handed to me in Fez was extreme, and multiplied by the men who materialized whenever I looked confused, again, every 2 minutes, to insist I was heading the wrong way, down a dead-end street, and needed to follow them. I'd been warned about these false guides who pretended to show tourists to their hotels, but steered them instead to their shops, and I knew how to respond. La shukran, I'd say firmly, no thank you. Then quicken my pace, perhaps turning a corner with confidence, and wind up even farther off course, at which point they'd request payment for their services. Finally, I received some advice. Let yourself get lost, a friend said. You're supposed to get lost. And when I no longer wish to be lost, ask a woman for directions. Women won't steer you wrong. This wisdom of both leaning into lostness and seeking guidance from women was still in my mind 6 months later when I began work on the Best Women's Travel Writing, Volume 12. And it's on my mind now, because the truth is, attempting to pen an introduction about travel today, in the midst of a global pandemic during which our passports lie fallow, in an era of climate change and catastrophic natural disasters, and at the dawn of a 400 years overdue revolution brought on by systemic racial injustice, I have never felt more lost as a writer. Let yourself get lost. You're supposed to get lost. And when I no longer wish to be lost, ask a woman for directions. Women won't steer you wrong. This book marks the 12th volume of the Best Women's Travel Writing series. Over the years, I've occasionally been asked, what is women's travel writing? And why is it different or special? I never quite nail the answer. It's complex. But I do know that in meandering through women's essays, I always seem to trip across something I'm not even aware I'm seeking, but vitally need. These somethings run the gamut from escape to inspiration to connection to catharsis. And always, lodged sturdily in there among everything else, is the truth. I always find truth, or more accurately, I am guided to it. So I'll stop right there for my introduction because I want to bring on and introduce our readers. So Annie, would you like to bring in Mathangi and Anna and Colette? I think we're bringing everyone. There you are. So, hi everyone. So welcome to Minneapolis, or I should say welcome back, because while I have never personally been to Minnesota, you actually all three have connections here. I wonder if you might tell us briefly about your connection to Minnesota and also where you live now. Colette, do you want to shout out to your Minnesota people?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Minnesota. I grew up in St. Paul. Hi to my family who's watching, my niece, my parents, my friends. And I lived in Minneapolis for a while, and it's just really close to my heart. I always love going back there and seeing everybody. And yeah, thanks for having me. Oh,
Anna,
and I lived this one now.
Anna, you lived there too for a while, right?
I did. I'm from northern Wisconsin originally, close to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but I lived for a time in the Twin Cities, and I was telling Lavinia earlier, it was the cool thing to do to skip school in high school in the 90s and drive 4 hours to the Mall of America. So, and I realized as I was preparing for this that in the essay that I'll be reading tonight, I reference the job I had out of college, and that job was actually, this isn't in the essay itself, but you all will know now that it was for an advertising agency in Duluth. So I was working remotely for them. So another little fun Minnesota connection there.
That's awesome. And Mathangi, you were born in Minnesota?
Yeah, I was actually born at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, because my father had a residency there, so that's how he stayed in the U.S. So he got a fellowship in Schenectady, New York, and then after that he got a residency. I think there might have been something in between there, but he ended up in Minnesota, which is funny because my family is from subtropical India, and he basically did a tour of like all the coldest places in the U.S. But I left there when I was 1, and I haven't been back. But I now live in Denver, Colorado, which is very close to Minnesota. So I'm hoping once travel is possible again, Minnesota is one of the first places I'd like to go.
Me too. My first stop is going to be Majors and Quinn. I've decided when I make my way finally to Minnesota. So, well, let's leave Minnesota, as it were, or wherever you all are tonight, and take you to some different places. Our first reader is Mathangi, who's going to be reading from her essay, Frangipani, which you don't know this actually, Mathangi, but it was the first story that I officially accepted in the book. It was,
thank you.
I read it and immediately fell in love with it. And it was originally published on Powell's blog. And so, let's see, by way of introduction, I will read her bio. Mathangi Subramanian is an award-winning Indian-American writer and educator. Her novel, A People's History of Heaven, was longlisted for the PEN/Faulkner Award and the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. Her middle grades book, Dear Mrs. Naidu, won the South Asian Book Award. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Al Jazeera America, Ms. Magazine, and Zora Magazine, among others. A former Fulbright Nehru Scholar, public school teacher, and senior policy analyst at the New York City Council, she received her doctorate in education from Columbia University Teachers College. So thank you for joining us, Mathangi.
Thank you so much for having me. So thank you everyone for having me. Sorry, I see that there's glare in my glasses, but I'm not really sure what I can do about it. So I'm gonna like lean back like this. So I always start my readings with a land acknowledgement, and I feel like today it's especially appropriate since we are reading about travel. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Denver, Colorado, which is the unceded ancestral traditional territory of the Navajo, Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux people. And today the story that I'm reading is called Frangipani, and it's about Bangalore, India. So I lived in Bangalore, India from I lived in India from 2012 to 2019. My family is originally from India, but this was the first time that I actually had gotten the opportunity to live there for a long period of time and as an adult. So this story takes place during the first year that I was there, and it is called Frangipani. Every evening, the limbs of the Frangipani tree that shaded our second-story apartment shivered and rustled. strewing star-shaped blossoms onto our balcony's tiled floor. Balmy lake breezes mixed the petals' thick perfume with the aromas of brewing coffee and fried snacks, wafting from our neighbors' kitchen windows. In the distance, auto rickshaws and motorcycles revved their engines, announcing the start of Bangalore's evening commute. The minute I heard the creaking branches, I'd stop whatever I was doing to come outside. Leaning over the balcony's wrought iron railing, I'd smile and wave at the black-haired girl who was, inevitably, perched somewhere on the tree's trunk, her bare feet tight against the rough bark, her long fingers plucking flowers. Namaskara Varna, I'd call out. Hege Idira, how are you? Namaskara Akka, I am fine, Varna would reply, waving back. Good, I'd say, reaching for clusters of newly opened flowers nestled between the leaves. I handed them to Varna in fistfuls, careful not to crush the petals, delicate as wishes. Varna's body was like a stretched rubber band, long and thin and taut with momentum. Ropey muscles lined her arms, and her hair, which looked like it had never been cut, hung past her hips in a straight, tightly wound braid. She wore sun-faded cotton salwar kameez and always had a plastic shopping bag looped around her wrist. She never wore shoes. Varuna's mother tongue was Kannada, a language she chirped like a parakeet, and one I was just beginning to learn. I'd greet her, ask her how she was doing. Always fine, big sister, always fine. And what she had for lunch, biryani or roti or halwa. Once I asked her what class she was in at school, 3rd standard, and how old she was, 11, and why she wasn't wearing a school uniform. I don't go to school, big sister. When my husband was home, he'd translate, falling easily into the Kannada he spoke while growing up in Bangalore in the 1990s. Can you ask her what the flowers are for? I asked him once. After a few rapid exchanges, my husband translated. She says they're for puja, they're auspicious. Her mother is praying for something and she needs them. I didn't ask what Varna's mother was praying for. I didn't have to. If she needed the flowers badly enough to send her daughter climbing strangers' trees, it must be something important. Once my landlady, who lived downstairs, caught Varna climbing the tree and flew into a rage. Get down from there, my landlady yelled, shaking her fist. Her hennaed hair quivered, and her cheeks flushed an angry pink. Those aren't yours. They're just flowers, I said. Why can't she have them? They're my flowers, my landlady said. She can't just take things. It's not right. For the next week, my landlady sat vigil in her front room, ready to spring outside the second she saw Varna within a few yards of a tree. Through our floor, which was her ceiling, I could hear her muttering about how poor people in Bangalore are out of control. During those weeks of hypervigilance, Varna and I developed a system. She would turn onto our street and look up at me. If my landlady was home, I'd signal that Varna should leave. If she wasn't home, I'd beckon frantically. Varna would flash up the tree, a brown streak of manic limbs, and the two of us would pluck furiously, filling her bag before we were discovered. I was in Bangalore because I had received a Fulbright fellowship to study India's publicly funded early childhood education centers. Most of these centers were in slums. So during my fieldwork, I found myself spending less time observing lessons and more time gossiping and giggling with the mothers who stopped by for rations, forms, or rest. The women were curious about me and the incongruous combination of my dark Indian skin and twangy Western accent. They asked me about my parents, my husband, my job. Inevitably, they'd ask me when my husband and I were going to have kids. Soon, I'd say. When you want children, here's what you do. Buy a packet of milk and take it to the kohl just there, one mother told me, gesturing in the direction of about 4 different Hindu temples. Or else you can go to another kohl down the road there and ask for a special puja, another said. The priest will give you ghee. If you eat that ghee, you'll get pregnant immediately. Don't forget to bring flowers, they all reminded me. Puja is always better with flowers. I wondered what kind of pujas were prescribed for women who wished for something besides marriage or children. What if a woman wanted a college degree or a book deal or a visa to another country? What if she wanted to leave her husband or move into her own home or start a career? I never asked, not because I didn't want to know, but because it didn't seem right. In the slums, women live in worlds that prohibited too much wanting or wishing, too much hoping. Women who test the limits of hope shouldn't expect help, human or divine. Men want, women provide. That's the way the world works. No one told me this specifically, but somehow they made sure I knew. One day, after another morning in the slums, I came home and stopped in front of the frangipani tree. Lost in thought, I plucked a plush bunch of blossoms and buried my nose in them, inhaling a fragrance like starlight. My landlady stepped outside, clutching an expensive purse and a set of house keys. "Oh," I said, holding up the flowers, "I'm so sorry." "Don't be silly, take," she said, breaking off a few more and handing them to me. "Thank you," I said. After a minute, I asked, "So it's okay to take these?" "Of course. Why do you ask?" "When Varna came, you didn't want her to have any," I said. When my landlady looked at me blankly, I said, "The little girl with the long braid?" "That girl? That's different," she said, wrinkling her nose in recognition. You please take as many as you like." One of the last times Varna visited me, she attracted the attention of the gang of 9 and 10-year-old boys who ruled our streets. They gathered at the foot of the tree, peering up into the branches, their faces wrinkled with suspicion. "What is she doing?" the leader called up to me. "Ask her," I told him. "Okay," he said, nodding. He turned to Varna and, switching to Kannada, asked, "What are you doing here?" She spoke to him so rapidly that I only understood every third or fourth word. Still, I knew it had something to do with pujas and flowers and her mother. "Did she tell you?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "She's doing it for puja. Can you help her?" After a minute, he said, nodding approvingly, "Okay, puja is good. We can help." He sent the youngest boy to get a plastic bag, then delegated the other 2 to go to the other frangipani trees in our block. The boys weren't very good at climbing trees, they were too young for that, but they managed to fill their bags. Varna dropped onto the pavement and accepted them graciously, her smile tight and proud. Then my landlady's red Toyota pulled into the driveway. "How dare you!" she yelled as she let herself out of the car, not even waiting for the driver to open the door as she usually did. "Those are mine." The boys watched curiously but didn't say anything. Neither did I. Varna turned on her heels and walked away, her steps rhythmic and measured, her back as straight and poised as a queen's. A few days before, when I had been caught with frangipani in my hand, I had stuttered out an apology. But Varna knew that those precious flowers and the power they held belonged to her just as much as they belonged to me, or my landlady, or the boys on my street. Knew that the poor deserve as much desire as the rich, that women and girls ought to be allowed the same number of wishes as boys and men. Knew that despite what anyone told her, she and her mother were entitled to their dreams. Varna's gods hadn't showered her with luck, but they weren't interested in withholding it. Only humans were interested in that. I watched her retreating back, and for the first time in years, I had the urge to pray. Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself and then I unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Mathangi. That was beautiful. Our next reader is Anna Vodicka. And this is another example of a first, this essay, because in my 6 years of editing the Best Women's Travel Writing, this is the first epistolary essay, or an essay that's written in the form of a letter, that I've ever published. But I knew as soon as I read this one that I wanted it. So let me introduce Anna to you. I need my glasses again. Anna Vodicka's essays have appeared in Afar, Brevity, Electric Literature, Guernica, Harvard Review, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Ms., Paste, and Lonely Planets, and Innocent Abroad. She teaches creative writing at Seattle's Hugo House and to women incarcerated at King County Jail. Thank you so much for being here with us, Anna.
I'm so grateful to be here. Yeah, and when I lived in the Twin Cities, Majors and Quinn was like the regular pilgrimage we took whenever we possibly could. So it's a total thrill to be here even virtually. So thanks, Lavinia. And Mathangi, I love that essay. It was so wonderful to hear you read it. So this is my essay called "To the Travelers Watching Reality TV." I have forgotten a great deal since 2006, but not the looks on your faces when I entered the hostel common room. In recent years, the memory has resurfaced with frequency. Haunted may be too strong a word, though I was fresh from the Mercado de las Brujas, the witches' market that day, bag full of potions, mouth full of coca leaves for the altitude. My pulse throbbed from the steep climbs of La Paz and the heady scents and visions of the market. Medicinal herbs, pots of feathers, and glassy-eyed frogs, dried llama fetuses tied up with string, and vials of elixirs to ward off illness and debt, to bring love, prosperity, health, fortune. You circled around the TV and bean bags and a sunken couch, deep in discussion until I walked in and silence fell like a spell cast on the room. "What's wrong?" I asked. You turned to me, all 8 or 10 of you, a local Bolivian desk clerk, a Romanian couple, a few Israelis post-mandatory service, faces from across the globe reflecting disbelief, grief, confusion, disgust, demand for an explanation. A Polish girl, the other solo female traveler among us, broke the silence. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is this what it's really like?" It was Ivanka I saw first, or someone who looked like Ivanka, as rich girls on reality shows did in the early aughts, platinum blondes in designer bikinis with untraceable accents, who were enrolled in private boarding schools or universities, but appeared already to be working professionals, employed in some hazy combination of model, actress, socialite, trailed always by cameras. In 2006, they were all Paris or Nicole or Ivanka to me, though I was an unreliable source on the subject. Didn't own a TV, didn't pay attention. I felt a special disorientation before reality shows, a phenomenon critics promised wouldn't last. In this episode, the rich girls in bikinis were washing cars, or play acting washing cars. There were hoses and buckets of soapy water. There was a line of Hummers and Ferraris parked alongside a pool, alongside a mansion, alongside fountains and manicured hedges. But the girls concentrated primarily on the positions of their bodies before the camera. They sprayed one another, straddled the hoods of their boyfriends' sports cars, held hoses to the sky like so much shook champagne. Occasionally, someone held a hose limply in the direction of a vehicle, laughed when they ruined the leather interior. But perhaps the biggest spectacle, from the perspective of anyone in landlocked Bolivia, they mostly let the water run. "This? No, I said. "I mean, yes, but no." Silence. "Most Americans are not like this. No one has this much money. This isn't real." "It isn't real?" An Israeli guy pointed me again to the screen, as if I had missed it. "It's happening." You nodded in collective agreement. Who could refute the evidence, the scene before our eyes? This image we projected to the world, to Bolivia, land of the water wars, of the world's largest salt flat and the highest from sea level city. Bolivia, where foreign gold mines sucked the land dry from below and the sun baked it close from above, and the earth was cracked and fissured, exposed riverbeds rippling like all the water that wasn't there. It made me thirsty just to look at it. My throat went dry. I flashed back to high school, Ivanka seductively pouting across the pages of 17, she in Paris and Nicole as much a mystery to me and my rural Midwestern girlfriends as we would have been to them. None of us had ever seen New York. And yet I simmered in guilt at the memory of long, hot showers, divine steam fogging over my reflection in the mirror. I felt suddenly like a reluctant and ill-equipped ambassador, naive and fumbling as a babe, though I was a freshly minted college grad, old enough to know what? The real world? Too much tuition's worth of Latin American literature? I barely felt qualified for my actual job, freelance copywriting for a healthcare marketing firm, a field that sounded suddenly ridiculous in Spanish in countries where healthcare is a human right, let alone the role of national spokesperson. Alone, abroad, during the war on terror, I was dodging questions about my president, working hard to mask my easy, credulous smile, my calcium-rich bones, straight from America's dairyland. I'd considered pinning a Canadian flag to my backpack, a tip from my fellow Americans. Before I left home, I'd made several trips to the salon to dye my naturally light blonde hair a less conspicuous dark brown. The joke of the fates or the brujas was on me. As soon as I hit the high altitude Andes, the sun bleached every strand a raging bright orange. That's how I passed through South America, drafting convincing prose about advancements in robotic surgery, birthing centers, and microdermabrasion with my head on fire. Is this what it's really like? A couple of Canadians looked guilty by association. Some of you grew so disgusted you turned to leave, and I couldn't blame you. I myself was searching frantically for a fire escape. To my relief, one of you reached for the remote. With the click of the power button, the show was over. I made a fast exit for my $3 bunk, though I can't say I slept that night, something gnawing at me beyond the usual discomforts of the shared dorm room. We parted ways the next day, all of us heading eventually towards some idea of home. But I remembered you years later, when a real-life Ivanka breezed past me in an airport, full makeup, hair smoothed professionally in place, as if she'd just wrapped a photo shoot. She retreated to a private lounge, a boxy room of floor-to-ceiling glass. Bored, I settled in to watch with everyone else, suddenly more interested in the manicured life behind the glass than the messy world of connections and departures behind me. I thought of you in 2010, when Bolivia passed the historic rights of Mother Earth law, built on principles of respect, harmony, multiculturalism, and the collective good. The legislation defined Mother Earth as a living, dynamic system made up of the undivided community of all living beings, and granted her rights to life, diversity, equilibrium, restoration, air, and water, free from pollution or commercial interests. And again in 2017, when Bolivia suffered its worst drought in decades. It's 2016. When Bolivia suffered its worst drought in decades, residents allowed to fill 2 jugs a day, every 3 to 4 days. And my country elected a reality TV star to its highest office, a man who boasts of plating his bathroom fixtures in gold. Is this real? You ask. We ask. They say that after a rain, a glassy surface of water settles over Bolivia's salt flats, converting the land into the world's largest mirror. I imagine the brujas, with their black braids and bowler hats, have something to do with this, holding a looking glass to the world. It takes a courage I didn't have to gaze into it, past the easy mirage of beauty or ugliness, a princess or a hag, to something real, something wounded, wrapped in great complexity and excruciating discomfort. I want to try again with you, to practice looking in the mirror, to practice staying in the room. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Such a powerful story. Okay, so our final reader for you is Colette Hanahan. And Colette is yet another example of another first for this book, because not only did she contribute a story, but she also did all the illustrations in the book. And I think it's the first time that we've had illustrations for Best Women's Travel Writing, but I think it's definitely the first time that a contributor did all the illustrations. So her story, Call of the Sirens, was first published on the GOX blog. And she's had many lives, which you will hear about in this bio. So Colette Hanahan is a San Francisco-based writer, painter, and illustrator who created all of the illustrations for the best women's travel writing. In addition to peddling knives in Minnesota, she has delivered mail at a retreat center in the woods of the Hudson Valley, applied makeup on brides-to-be at a salon in Brooklyn, steamed blouses for models in Manhattan, taught art and yoga to adults with autism in Chicago, mentored teens at a boarding school in New Mexico, and organized fundraisers for artists with life-threatening illnesses in San Francisco. So tonight we have the pleasure of hearing her read. Thank you so much for coming, Colette.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Lavinia. It is just an honor, first of all, to be here with you guys, Mathangi, Anna, Lavinia, Traveler's Tales, Larry and James, and Annie at Majors and Quinn. I just wish we could all be there right now. If we could be in there, all of us together at a live reading, that would be incredible. All of our Minnesota friends and family, but this will have to do. And I'm so honored to be reading this guy. It's called, it actually starts out in Minnesota. It's called Call of the Sirens. Or it goes into it later, but it's kind of switched up. Okay. It sounded like a manatee-sized pumice stone exfoliating the bottom of the van. Then came a bucking bronco jolt. Thrown forward, we braced ourselves on whatever we could. Amps, boxes, a cooler, my backpack, one another. The driver said something in German. Everyone laughed but me. The girl translated. We are stuck on a rock. At this point, I knew 4 things. I had climbed into the back of a windowless van with 7 strangers, mostly men. We'd been driving for over an hour on the highway. We turned onto a dirt road, and now we were in the middle of the woods somewhere in France. My head got hot and prickly. My chest felt heavy, like a small animal had curled up on it. The night before I left for my trip, in the kitchen at my parents' house, my dad had given me a short father-daughter talk. Remember, Coletta, he said, making eye contact over the counter. All men are scum. My brother, eating a chicken wing at the sink, looked up. Yep. My other brother, sitting next to me, nodded with raised eyebrows. I was fresh off a lucrative summer business venture as a cutlery saleswoman in Minnesota. It was one neighborhood, Sunfish Lake, that had put me on the map. I made my way around the lake in my brother's Camaro, selling hundreds of knives. Bird's beak paring knives, fishing knives with built-in rulers, hunting knives, boning knives, turkey carving knives, knives designed with warm bread in mind, flexible, pop your brownies out of a pan, intact knives. This was a favorite among my 10-year and under market. And most popular, the super shears, which I'd cut a penny with to conclude my slicing and dicing demo. It was all effortless, and I was astonished. At the end of the summer, I found myself on stage at a convention somewhere in South Dakota. Hundreds of people were standing and applauding as I accepted a 2-foot trophy adorned with flaming knives. Hannahan, I have big plans for you, said my manager that night. But I had plans of my own. I'd saved enough money from my cutlery enterprise to take a semester off from college and travel abroad for the first time. I planned to see Ireland, France, Italy, Spain, England, and Scotland for 5 months. A sepia-tone slideshow of me, a Midwestern girl coming of age in Europe, flashed through my mind. I imagined myself strolling the streets of Paris at sunrise wearing a white scarf tied with a sophisticated knot and red lipstick as the scent of chocolate croissants wafted from the bakery. Befriending an Irish band at a Galway pub and learning to play the fiddle. And then standing up, possibly, to help row a gondola in Venice. Why not? My Euro pass would not only be my ticket to meeting adventurous, open-minded friends from all over the world, it would also be my ticket to inspiration. I saw myself at the Musée d'Orsay, inches from the paintings I had seen only on slides in art history classes. My eyes tearing up. I'd learn a little Italian here, pick up some French there. I'd discover how to say, I am a self-made woman in Spanish. Maybe even find my calling. But a month in, the only things sepia-toned were my teeth. From chain drinking, cups of Barry's Irish tea. I was hovering in Ireland, afraid to move on. and sinking into a routine. I'd spend my days wandering the streets of Dublin, Belfast, and Galway, getting damp and cold, then return to my hostel dorm room to read Left Behind novels in my bunk and listen to Van Morrison on my Walkman. At night, I'd venture out to a cafe, eat a bowl of leek soup, and journal about all the ways I would live differently when I returned to the US. Meanwhile, the scenes I'd scripted for myself in my European tourism commercial were rare and fleeting. I'd stand on a bridge with a pretty view, peel an orange, and while eating it, feel at peace. Like I was onto something. And then, when it was gone, I'd think, okay, now what? One morning, I woke up early in the top bunk of a Galway hostel, sad to the bone. I slipped out of the thick-aired dorm room and made my way to the dining hall. As I waited for my brown bread to toast, I scouted a place to sit. All the tables were filled with early rising backpackers, but I noticed one open spot across from a slight man, maybe twice my age. I hoped I wouldn't have to make conversation. "Good morning," said the man, looking up with kind eyes. "How are you?" I immediately broke into tears. I didn't think it was going to be like this. I'm really lonely. I took a sip of tea. "Well, that's good." "What do you mean?" I wondered if he'd heard me correctly. "Don't fight it," he said, smiling. "When you feel a feeling really deeply and you don't fight it, that's when life opens up and you see it in a new color." He took a sip. I was silent. And with every new color, the world is more beautiful. The loneliness won't last, but the color will. It's yours to keep. Walking around in the rain later that day, thinking about sleeping another night with my hat on, I decided it was time to head out of Ireland and get my trip back on track. It was mid-March. France would surely be warmer, bursting with flowers and fresh starts. Paris, the Riviera, Provence. It couldn't go wrong. But when I arrived in Avignon, I was still lonely. I should have seen this coming. I had grown up as an observer, always fascinated by my siblings and friends' ability to fully enjoy themselves. On beach days, trips to the amusement park, at birthday parties, all the classic, "I was so excited I barely slept last night" activities. I just couldn't match their level of enthusiasm. I began to suspect I was miswired. Thankfully, my mom was studying to be a psychologist, so I had access to her massive bookshelves full of self-help material. In high school, I listened to character development cassette tapes and read What Color is Your Parachute? How to Be a No-Limit Person, and several volumes of Chicken Soup for the Soul. At night, I lay in bed replaying my day, taking note of all my interactions until I fell asleep. I often wondered how it would feel to stop overthinking and live like everyone else. My older cousin, the one who'd assured me, against my academic advisor's strong advice, that it was a smart move to switch my major from advertising to English, had lived in Eritrea for a year. He'd send my family long letters detailing his life on the coast of the Red Sea in East Africa, what he was learning, whom he was meeting, all the sounds and smells and tastes of his village across the world. Rereading those letters over and over, I noticed an aliveness bubbling up in me. I was sure travel would change me. But in Europe, as the days passed, I felt like I'd failed in all the things I'd set out to do. I was only going further inward, wrapping myself in layers and layers of gauze. On my last day in Avignon, I wandered the cobblestone paths looking for a shady spot to read while waiting for my train to Paris that night. People always found what they needed in Paris, it seemed. Decked out in my baggy cords, t-shirt, and running shoes, I lugged my backpack, which had grown to the size of a well-fed seal. Then I saw them. Willowy bodies fanned across the lawn by the palace. They looked like a shoot for an edgy perfume ad, a mating call. So much bare skin, so much snug fabric. There were 6 guys and 1 girl who was wearing a rose-colored velour bustier. One guy played guitar, another a drum. Some sang along. Others were just splayed out on the grass, soaking in their collective coolness. Modern-day sirens could not stop staring. The girl motioned for me to sit down. "Come," she said, smiling. Any other time, I would have made up any excuse. But I was so desperate to escape my own thoughts, I sat down. She asked if I was from the US, and I asked if it was obvious. We laughed. I asked if she was from Ireland. She was from Germany, but her English teacher was Irish. Her friends didn't speak English well, she said, but she wanted to learn because she was a poet. Why English, I asked. It's simple. The word strawberry. It's so beautiful. In German, it's
Erdbeere.
multimedia. Her face pinched up as she said it. Strawberry, she replied, and repeated, smiling, like she was tasting one for the first time. Then the guy in pleather pants stood up and said something in German. Come, said the girl, gathering her things. It's time to dance. Thanks, but I have a train to catch. What time does it depart? I considered lying, but I couldn't. 8 o'clock? It's the last train to Paris. Not a problem. She turned to her friends with her hand in the air. She will join us. The guy with the sleeveless half shirt slung my bag over his shoulder and stepped into the pack of guys walking away. What was that my dad had said about men? I smiled at the girl, trying to hide my apprehension, and followed. We stopped in the parking lot by a dirty white van with no windows, and as I soon saw, no back seats. The exact vehicle I'd been warned about in elementary school stranger danger classes. I hesitated, and then I ducked into the back. Colette, we are stuck, the girl repeated. We have to get out. Damn it, I thought. It's a drug cartel? Organ poachers? Is this cooler for icing my kidneys? I cleared my head. No, the girl is nice. I can trust them. They just love to dance in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, in isolated places far away from where they could have danced. The guy in the passenger seat hopped out and slid open the side door. I pushed myself up from the ratty blanket covering the floor of the van and crawled over all kinds of cords snaked into tight piles. The tops of spiny trees appeared as the wake of dust settled behind us. Then the girl turned to me. We are close. We will walk. She laced her arm through mine and I faked a smile. The cratered road ended in a clearing. We are on a peninsula and a lake with no sign of any other human in any direction. A few minutes later, the guys pulled up and unloaded a generator, a card table, 2 huge amps, and a turntable. One of them cracked open the cooler and passed around cold, stuffy bottles of beer special. As the music started and the punctuated beat climbed, the weight on my chest began to dissolve. The same 3 notes repeated, then faster. Woven into the mix, a deep voice boomed. Tance, 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 tance. Then on a loop, a woman with a sexy voice. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The music ramped up until we were like stones being polished in a rock tumbler. There were only 8 of us, but we stayed as close as penguins, bumping into each other, trying on one another's moves. We danced like this for hours, wild, drumming up clouds of russet dust. I looked at the girl. Her eyes were closed, and her head rode the beat like a boat in the waves. She was the queen, and this was her land. She swirled her arms through the air and moved her hips in her first language. The sun toasted our heads and noses and cheeks. The guys pranced around with spaghetti legs around the girl and me. I couldn't stop smiling. If we had spontaneously combusted, I wouldn't have been surprised. And then, when my lips felt phantom, the beat cranked up again until it exploded. Our hands shot up into the sky like it was the end of a 20-year drought, and we danced even harder. The lake breeze crawled over the peninsula and threaded through the tall grass, clearing the dust. The pretty, controlled movements I learned in dance class as a girl unfastened until I was a crane, building up momentum to fly off the lake. I thrashed my arms, I fanned out my chest, I lifted my face to the sun. I wanted to run at life, jump up, wrap my arms and legs around it, bury my face in it, curl up with it until morning. I felt it sneak up the back of my shirt as I twirled. Years of self-consciousness and fear unspooled from around my body. In a few hours, I would catch my train from Avignon to Paris, waving as the van pulled away. But for those moments, as I danced with strangers in the middle of the woods, thousands of miles from home, I saw the world set ablaze, filtered through the hues of spontaneity, trust, and abandon. Colors that were mine now to keep. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette. I love coming of age stories, and they're just always so joyful and illuminating. So we are going to have a little bit of a discussion now about travel writing and women's travel writing. And if you have any questions for us, please put them in the chat for one of us, for all of us, about anything related to travel. But what I want to say about all your stories is first, is that one of the things that I love most about them is how, well, I'll give a little background. Every time I teach a writing class, every time I speak at a conference, I feel like I always say the same thing, which is that a place is not necessarily a story and an experience is not necessarily a story, but a very simple interaction with someone while traveling can make for an incredible story. And I think that that's one of the things I love about all your stories, was just these people you met who led to really powerful breakthroughs or shifts in consciousness, even if it was, like in Anna's case, uncomfortable. But I wondered if any of you could sort of speak to that, how travel and meeting people on the road leads to those kinds of awakenings, and especially as women, and the way we move through the world and interact with people. Anyone?
Why would this speak to that? Three. Yeah.
Please.
Okay. I was just thinking about solo travel as a woman versus, traveling with friends, partner. It's such a different experience. And I just think of the times that I have been traveling solo. I mean, I feel like the highs and lows are a lot. It's higher highs and then lower lows. Like you arrive in Thailand at 2 a.m. because your flight was delayed. You're by yourself, and maybe you like have food poisoning, and then you're by yourself. But then it's like, within 1 or 2 people, you're gonna find some kind of connection, and you see like how magical and beautiful the world is, and how people are truly friendly, And then when traveling with other friends or family, you have that already built in, which is so comfortable and warm and wonderful. But it's traveling alone, and especially as a woman, like I would have never met that man sitting at the Galway hostel. I would have been talking to my friend, and I still think about what he told me when I'm having low moments. I'm like, oh, this is a new color. Like I'm gonna come out of this. It's just like, now I have more empathy for other people. I mean, I have a new feeling and a new color. So, and then of course, dancing with people in the woods. I mean, that wouldn't have happened probably with a group of friends, but yeah. I think sometimes it's scary and but I think the rewards are really great.
Yeah, like strangers stretch us, It's like, it requires trust, and it also requires a certain. Also, this piece I read was a travel trip, and I trusted so many strangers, and in that process, I also had to sort of really get into trusting myself. I think, especially as a woman traveling. Traveling alone, but I wanted to mention too that this essay had originally been published in a wonderful literary travel website called Off Assignment, and they have a regular column called Letter to a Stranger, and it's just a wonderful writing prompt in general, I think. But I was talking with the Colleen Kinder, who's the editor of Off Assignment, and she was saying, I keep thinking like, at some point we're going to exhaust the number of stranger narratives, right? Like it's just like people are going to start beating the same drum at a certain point, and it's never true. Like she's constantly surprised, and I think that alone is just speaks to the power of the stranger in the traveler's experience.
And is it different? I mean, Mathangi and we were talking a little bit about how our identity maybe helps that, the way for me, I think it's the way we're perceived, gives us more access than perhaps men would have. I feel like I get invited into people's homes, or, as you know, I get lost again, and people are always trying to help me. And would they be as readily helpful if I were not a woman traveling alone? I don't know. Mathangi, what do you think?
Well, for me, it's not just my gender, it's also my race when I travel, right? So, for example, I used to work in my 20s, I worked in international development, and I remember traveling for work to Nigeria, and I was in charge of the project, and I showed up, and everybody there was like, where is the person who is giving us our grant money? Where is the American? And I'm like, it's me. And they're like, but you're not white. And I'm like, but I hold all your money. So maybe change that tone, right? So traveling in India and in South Asia in general is a very different experience for me, because not only, I mean, just on a basic level, like I speak the language, my family is from there. So I grew up in the US, but I'm familiar with the religion. I'm familiar with some of the cultural expectations in South India. I lived in Delhi for 4 years, and that was a very different experience for me. But I think, part of what allowed me to have this relationship with Varna is that, unlike in other places I've traveled, in India, particularly when I'm wearing traditional clothes, and I, like these glasses I bought in India, like my hair was being cut in India, people were much more willing to speak to me because I was very familiar to them. And I familiar in the sense that they just assumed I was like an elite Indian, which I guess I am. I'm more American than Indian. And so, the kinds of conversations I had with women there were very much based in the fact that it was very much the opposite of my experience traveling in the West or even like living in the US. It was like, when I'm in the US, I always feel like I have to like prove where I come from. And in India, like, like I would be in these Anganwadis, in these early childhood centers, and people would very justifiably ask me where I was from. And the teachers I worked with would be like, oh, she's Indian. Like, her people are from Chennai. Like, so it felt very like inclusive. And because of that, I felt like I had access to strangers in a way that I hadn't when I had traveled previously.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like it's an anthology of women's travel writing. So, so obviously it makes sense, but every time, or at least almost every time we do an event, there's someone who says, what's different and special about travel writing. And I always have, like I said in my intro, a hard time answering that question, because of course, there shouldn't be any difference. Women can write just as well as men and can travel just as well as men. But I do think that what I'm often drawn to is that sort of moment of transformation and that sort of inner story. And I do think a lot of it comes from the way that we move through the world differently. I think we respond to people differently. I think we respond to crisis differently. And like I said, I think we're perceived differently. But yeah, Anna, I have written 3 letters to a stranger for that website. And I will say, I think that's the thing that I miss most right now, is not the travel itself, but that those, just meeting people of different cultures. And, I miss strangers. So, which is, it's a very estranging time. And I miss that. So, what do you guys, we're probably about at our time limit, and there aren't any questions in the chat. So maybe, do you want to tell me something that you are thinking about being a travel writer during a quarantine, what you miss or what you look forward to, or anything like that as we wrap up?
Well, I I think it's funny you guys are talking about missing strangers because I actually really miss my family because I can't see them without traveling, right? Like my parents are here, but everybody else, my husband's family, like all my relatives are in India. So I want the pandemic, and like in India, like here, it's like when we get vaccinated, and in India, it's like if we get vaccinated, right? So I'm missing. I know a lot of people are missing strangeness, and in normal times I would be missing that too. But I'm really missing familiarity right now, and just being able to know that I can go, see people that I love.
Yeah. Well, Annie, do you have any questions for us or anything that you want us to talk about before we wrap up?
Hello, can you hear me? This is my disembodied voice because I fit another video on this screen. Well, look at this. Just in this moment, we have received a question from Plaid Spaceship. Thank you for watching, Plaid Spaceship. So I would love to hear from any of you who have an answer to this, any and all. Do you often feel in the moment that you're witnessing or experiencing something that will make a good travel essay later? So I guess this is a question of like, what's your process of being a travel writer?
I mean, I'll go first. I definitely sometimes think, wow, this is terrible. Wow, this is scary. Oh, this is going to make a really good story. I should pay attention. I should take notes. It's like when the bad thing happens as a travel writer, it's kind of better than a boring thing, than nothing happening, like a trip where nothing goes wrong. Like I was on assignment in Korea, and I was on assignment, so I knew I was going to be writing, but I was supposed to be taking a Taekwondo lesson. And I twisted my ankle on the very first day, and I was like, well, at least I get a story. There's my lead for that. But yeah, I think I do feel that way. But I think, like, as a travel writer, I'm also always on the lookout for a story. And for me, again, that comes through connecting with a local. So what about you guys?
I was gonna say I do, and I'm always wrong. Like I always end up writing about something totally, like if I think it's gonna be a good essay in the moment, it's usually a terrible essay. I don't know about you guys. I have a really bad instinct. I always end up writing about something totally mundane, and it makes a much better essay. But I think I just have bad instincts. But what about you guys?
That's funny. What about you, Anna?
Yeah, I do think this is the importance of keeping a notebook, right? Because you don't know really what's going to be the thing. Sometimes there will be an image or a sensory experience that just like maybe I'm keen to in the moment. And that's where I teach as well, and I tell my students, like, pay attention to those things that hang on, that sort of hook into you, the memories, even if it's a snapshot that you don't know why you remember it, but you do. I mean, this essay I read tonight was like, I wrote the essay 10 years later, but I could never get rid of that image of the discomfort of that room. And every detail is so, strong in my mind because it was such a heightened experience. So yeah, yes and no, but I'm probably along with Mathu, like on the bad instincts.
That's funny. How about you, Colette?
Usually for me, I mean, it's generally when I'm traveling alone, and I tend to, just as an introvert, I want to just sort of like hide. And then it's me going out and when I keep saying yes to things, and then something will unfold in a way that, you never see it happening. Those have maybe been my best stories, but it is usually when something seems to have gone wrong. But then it ends up with like chance meetings or, like creative breakthroughs or, a new friend or just like a changed way of the way I see the world or the way that I have intended to use my trip. Or I'll be like, I'm not here to do this. And then I'll say yes to something and then it unfolds in a different way. So I guess,
I think the nice thing about travel essays is that there's no sort of deadline, I guess, or time limit. I mean, I've written essays about things that happened 20 years ago. I had one essay in an earlier edition that the writer had been sitting on for like 50 years. I want to say 50 years. It was from maybe my math's off, but it was from the summer of '69. And she had gone there as like, a teenager or something. And she'd been sitting on that story for, all those decades, and decided to write it. And that's the beauty of a travel essay. So yes, keeping a journal and writing down the things that you won't be able to recreate later, like the senses and anything that you couldn't look up, how you felt. Because you just never know. You can always, even if it's some little anecdote, you could always include it in a story. So, but yeah, well, I guess, Annie, unless you have any housekeeping, we should just thank everyone for coming to Minnesota with us tonight.
Yes, that was awesome. My only housekeeping is that I just dropped the link to the book, Best Women's Travel Writing, Volume 12, on the Majors and Quinn website into the comments there. So you can take that link and go straight to the books page on our website if you want to check out a copy, because there's even more stories in there. Yeah. Oh, yeah, my cat's meowing up a storm. And yeah, so please, if that's something you want to look into, the link's right there. Even if not, just by watching this event, you are supporting an independent bookstore. So thank you very much. Thanks to all 4 of you for being here and everyone for watching. And we will see you at the next virtual event. And someday, maybe we'll see each of you in Majors and Quinn itself. Yay, come visit. Yeah, that's all, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much.